Trump administration also sanctioned key individuals in the Hong Kong government, including...
Today's story is about the real-life string of murders in the 1990s that inspired the very famous horror movie Scream. As such, today's video is going to be graphic and distressing, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious deliberative story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 1 or 2 times every week. Hide outside of the like button's house while they are watching Game 7 of the World Series, and anytime the game starts to get good, change the channel with your universal remote. So also please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. Going to be a freshman that year at the University of Florida. And apparently she had been so excited after getting her acceptance letter that her dad, Frank, had gone out and got a gold necklace for her that had the school's mascot, an alligator, dangling from it. And Christine wore it all the time. 2 days earlier, Christine and her new roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larson, the two had actually met over the summer when they took some summer classes together. They had actually already come to Gainesville and they had moved in to this white apartment complex that Patricia and Frank were now parked outside of. And after unpacking some of their things in their apartment, Christine and Sonia had left and gone into town and grabbed a bite to eat at a local restaurant. And then afterwards, Christine had used a payphone to call back home and tell her parents how well it was going and how much she already enjoyed her roommate and how excited she was for the year. And she told Patricia and Frank that she would call them the following day. But the following day came and went, and Patricia and Frank did not hear from their daughter. And they had no way to call her because she had not set up her landline in her apartment. But Patricia and Frank, they told each other that, of course, everything was fine. You know, she just got to college, she's excited, she's probably out having a good time, and she just forgot to call. And anyways, Patricia and Frank had already planned a visit to see their daughter in Gainesville the next day, which was Sunday. And so fast forward back to that Sunday, and Patricia and Frank are now parked outside of their daughter's apartment complex. They still haven't heard from her, but they're still telling themselves everything's fine, she's probably just busy. And so they get out of their car and they walk over to the building and they go through one of the front access doors that brings them into the building. They find themselves inside of this carpeted stairwell where at every level on the way up there were doors leading off to each of the apartments. They made their way up to the second level where they knew their daughter's apartment was, and they walk up to her door, and before they even knock or turn the doorknob or anything, they notice on the door there are all these notes, these handwritten notes that have been taped all over it. And they read a couple of them, and they were notes from some of Christine and Sonia's friends on campus that apparently had tried to stop by over the last weekend, but had not been able to make contact with Christine or Sonia. And so these notes said things like, hey Christine, you know, we came over to try to get you to come out with us, but you didn't come to the door, so we left without you. Sorry, you know, give us a call when you get in. And so obviously the parents are totally worried given the circumstances. They don't know where their daughter is. They've been telling themselves everything is fine, and now these notes make it seem like everything is not fine. But the parents, they keep their cool, and they just start knocking on the door and calling out for their daughter. But there's no answer. And so Patricia and Frank, they start to panic at this point, and they leave the carpeted stairwell. They go outside, and they find a maintenance worker that works for this building, and they explain their situation with their daughter and how they can't get in touch with her, and can he please let them in to make sure she's okay. The maintenance worker said he couldn't without speaking to his manager, and so he goes to his manager, and the manager, she says, that's fine, but we need to get the police involved. They need to escort us into the apartment. And so the maintenance worker calls the police and requests this escort, and a few minutes later, a single Gainesville police officer arrives at the apartment complex. And he tells Patricia and Frank that just as a precaution, I need you guys to stay outside. So they stay right outside those front access doors. They're outside of the apartment building. And then this officer, along with the maintenance worker and the manager of the building, those three, they go inside the stairwell. They go up to the second floor, and apartment, which basically immediately opens up to their living room. And in the middle of the living room is a couch that's angled towards the right side of the room where a TV has been set up. And so the officer, again, as he walks in, he's calling out, trying to get the girl's attention, but there's no answer. Behind him is the maintenance worker and the building manager, and they begin making their way towards the right side of the room, opening that TV to see if maybe someone was laying on the couch. And as they round that corner and can finally actually see the front of the couch, the maintenance worker, after seeing what he saw, screams out and runs out of the apartment. He runs down the stairs, out the access doors, and begins vomiting on the grass and sobbing right next to Frank and Patricia. Naturally, Frank and Patricia, after seeing this, are immediately concerned that something's wrong with their daughter. And so they run inside, they go up the stairs, and they start running into the apartment. And the police officer and the building manager, they try to stop them from getting in, but there was nothing stopping them. They managed to push past those two. They get into the living room and they're calling out for their daughter, and eventually they make their way over to the side of the couch and they see their daughter, Christine. She's lying on the ground in front of the couch. She's on her back, she has no clothes on, and she's been stabbed to death. And whoever has killed her has positioned her in this very suggestive sexual lewd position, as if they were trying to demean her as much as possible and shock whoever found her. And so after these totally devastated and wrecked parents are escorted out of the apartment, this one police officer, he continues searching the apartment. And so he searches the rest of the first floor. There's no sign of Sonia. He goes upstairs and he finds Sonia. She's laying on her bed. She also has no clothes on. She's been stabbed to death, and she's positioned on the side of the bed in a sort of suggestive lewd position, much like Christine downstairs. It would later be determined that Christine had been sexually assaulted, but Sonia had not been. The officer at this point leaves the apartment. He goes outside. He walks past the grieving parents who are being consoled by the manager and the maintenance worker, and the officer goes over to his car and uses his radio to call in for backup. A forensics team comes out to the apartment and they begin processing the scene, and right away they discover on the outside of the door frame of the door leading into the apartment, there were markings on the edge, like someone had used a screwdriver or some similar instrument to pop open the door. They also found there was a towel and some soap that was lying on the ground near Christine's body and near the couch that had apparently been used to both clean Christine's body and also clean some other parts of the apartment, and so they believe this was done to try to intentionally destroy evidence, suggesting the killer or killers were somewhat sophisticated. They also discovered there was some residue on Christine's wrists that indicated at some point her hands had been bound by duct tape, but when she was found, her hands were not bound and there was no duct tape from her wrists. And so whoever had done this had at some point removed the duct tape and taken it away. And so investigators believed that the killer or killers had used the duct tape to immobilize Christine for the attack. And then after she was deceased, they had removed that tape in order to be able to get her arms up over her head, which seemed to increase the shock value of this lewd position they had put her in. Based on what they saw inside of this apartment, the police were convinced they were up against a group of killers or a killer that had targeted these two girls. That this was not some random attack, that this was calculated, this was on purpose, and if they didn't get caught, they were going to strike again. And so even though the police really didn't have any leads to operate on, they just had this crime scene and they were looking for maybe someone with duct tape and a knife and a screwdriver, I mean, that was really about it at this point. And so even though they have virtually nothing, because there were thousands and thousands of young people flooding Gainesville for the start of the new school year at the University of Florida, literally the following day, Monday, classes were starting. Because of all these young people in town, the police felt it was very important that they got the media to put out a bulletin to all these people in town that there was potentially a killer or killers on the loose. And so that night, Sunday evening, this news bulletin goes out and it basically just told residents of Gainesville to stay indoors and stay in groups, and if you needed to go outside, travel in groups, and just overall stay vigilant until we figure out who did this. 12 hours before Christine Powell and Sonia Larson were discovered, an 18-year-old Gainesville woman named Krista Hoyt did not show up for work. Krista was a student at Santa Fe Community College, which was right down the road from the University of Florida. Florida. That year, she was planning to transfer to the University of Florida, and then after graduation, she wanted to pursue a career in forensics with the FBI. And so given her interest in law enforcement, while she was a student, she had gotten a part-time job working in the records department of the sheriff's office. And apparently, at this sheriff's office, she was famous for always coming to work, no matter what, including the time that she got her wisdom teeth removed, and then an hour after coming home, she showed up for work. And so on this Saturday night, when Krista was supposed to be showing up for work, and she did it, and she didn't call ahead, and no one could get in touch with her on her landline, everybody at the sheriff's office was really concerned. And so they waited around for about an hour, hoping that she might just show up with some story about why she was late, but she never showed up, she didn't call, they still couldn't get in touch with her. And so in the very early hours of Sunday morning, the sheriff's office called the Gainesville police and asked them to do a welfare check on Krista. And so 2 police officers from the Gainesville Police Department, they show up at the apartment belonging to Krista Hoyt. Krista lived alone, and she lived about 2 miles away from Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. And so these 2 officers, they get there, and they walk up to the front door, and they knock, but there's no answer. And they try the doorknob, it's locked. And so one of the officers walks around to the back of this apartment, and he sees there's a glass sliding door. And so he knocks on the glass sliding door, it's locked, and then he notices the drape that's inside the apartment that's covering up this sliding glass door. It reaches almost to the ground, but not all the way. There's a couple of inches on the bottom. If you were laying on the ground, you could actually look through this little space and see into the apartment. And so that's what he does. He lies down and he puts his flashlight up and he looks through this couple-inch gap on this window. And as soon as the light illuminates what's inside of this apartment, he finds Krista. Krista is sitting on the edge of a bed that's not that far away from the sliding glass door, and she's facing the door. She's kind of hunched over at the edge of the bed. She's got no clothes on, and she's got stab marks all over her back, and she's missing her head. And her head was next to the bed to the left, up on the shelf, and it was positioned in such a way that it almost appeared like the head was looking down at the detached body. When this crime scene was processed, the forensics team immediately noticed there were marks on the backsliding glass door where someone had used probably a screwdriver or something similar to pop the door open. And then they also found residue of duct tape on Krista's wrists, but the duct tape was gone. She was found with her hands not bound. It would later be determined that Krista had been sexually assaulted before she had been murdered. The obvious similarities between Krista's crime scene and Christine and Sonia's crime scene were initially only recognized by Gainesville police because much of the information about the 2 crime scenes was not public. But that Sunday evening, when the media asked them to put out that bulletin to all Gainesville residents to say that there could be a killer or killers on the loose, it didn't take long for residents of Gainesville and news anchors to begin speculating that you have these 2 murders that have happened really close together physically. They're less than 2 miles apart, and they've probably occurred within the last 24, 48 hours. So they've happened in rapid succession. They're both unsolved. And so even without intimate details of the crime scene, it wasn't hard to say, I think these 2 are probably connected. And so that night, Sunday evening, Gainesville really went into a state of panic. And within hours of this news, you had stores all over Gainesville that had sold out their deadbolts and locks, their mace, their stun guns, their baseball bats, their actual guns, their knives. I mean, people were really trying to arm themselves to protect themselves against this unknown threat that was murdering students in Gainesville. And the police, even though they did not come out and substantiate the claims that, perhaps these 2 homicides are connected, they did believe they were. And so that night, Sunday night, as all this chaos is kind of unfolding in town, the police put hundreds of officers all over the place, on foot on every street corner. They had police cars and trucks parked all over the place. I mean, the entire town was on an extreme heightened alert because the police believed another attack was imminent. And so all they could do was try to come out in force to try to discourage the killer or killers from striking again. But as it would turn out, it didn't work. By the following morning, so Monday morning, what was happening in Gainesville had gone from just being a Florida story to a national story, and everybody all over the country was talking about it. And one woman named Lisa Byers, who was in her 20s, she did not live in Gainesville, but she had a very close friend who did. She was 23-year-old Tracy Paulus. Tracy had taken some years off from college, but that year had decided to go back and give it another go. And so she was enrolled at the University of Florida. And so Lisa called Tracy and said, hey, I'm watching the news. This is crazy what's happening in your town. How are you holding up? And Tracy would tell her that, I'm just as concerned as everybody else. It's terrifying to think there are a killer or killers on the loose, but I think I'm okay because I have my roommate. Tracy's roommate was 23-year-old Manny Taboda, who was this big, strong former football player who was very close with Tracy. The two had never dated, but they had been very good friends for a number of years. And he too had taken some time off of school and had agreed to go back because Tracy had convinced him, come back, get your degree with me, and we'll live together. And so when the news broke about these killings happening in their town, Manny had told Tracy that he would protect her, that nothing would happen to her. And so when Lisa heard this from Tracy, that she thought that she was okay because she has Manny and, he'll look after her, and they were not planning to really leave the apartment much besides classes, Lisa was reassured, but she was still worried. And so she told Tracy, please give me a call this evening after you come back from classes just to let me know that everything is okay. And so Tracy said she would, and then they hung up. And then that evening, Tracy did not call Lisa back. So Lisa tried calling Tracy, but no one picked up. And so that night, Lisa went to bed. She was very worried, but she went to sleep. And then early the next morning, which was Tuesday morning, she tried calling Tracy again, but there was no answer. And so Lisa reached out to a mutual friend of theirs that lived in the same apartment complex in Gainesville. His name was Tommy. And so she asked Tommy, can you please go over to Tracy's apartment and make sure she and Manny are okay? And so Tommy said, no problem. I'll give you a call from Tracy's landline once I talk to her. So about 5 minutes later, Tracy got a call, she picked it up, and it was Tommy calling from Tracy's landline, and he was just screaming. When the police arrived at Tracy's apartment, they found Tracy in her bedroom, and like the other victims, she had no clothes on, she was positioned on the side of the bed in a very suggestive, lewd position. She had been stabbed to death and actually assaulted. And then down the hall from Tracy, they found Manny. He was in his bed, and he too had been stabbed to death, except he had his clothes on, and he was not positioned in a suggestive position. He had kind of died wherever he was, and that was the position they found him in. The forensics team, when they processed the scene, they found markings on the outside of the back sliding door, where it looked like someone had used a screwdriver to pop open the door, and then on Tracy's wrist, they found that residue from duct tape, but there was no duct tape that had been removed. At this point, to the police, it was undeniable that they were up against a serial killer or killers. And when the news broke that there was now a fourth and fifth victim, and they were both college students, and one of them was now this big strapping man that apparently was taken down just as easily as these other four petite women, this threw Gainesville into an absolute state of pandemonium. Suddenly, it felt like no one could protect them. The people in Gainesville, they were fair game. It didn't matter that police were out in force in the streets, and you had people walking around with guns and baseball bats and mace, and you had people locking their doors and sleeping in groups. It was like no measures were actually stopping these killings from happening. Whoever was doing it was killing with impunity. And so that day, Tuesday, you had hundreds and hundreds of students from the University of Florida just leaving the school, who just didn't come back. And as for the police, they called in the FBI and the National Guard. And so by that night, Tuesday night, there were literally hundreds of officers and state police officers all over the place. There were helicopters overhead, both police helicopters and news helicopters with spotlights. They had National Guard